Hello and welcome to a special edition of Redleg Roundtable where us, the Riverfront hosts, tell you why we are Reds fans. Tim Daniel, you're my first guest, and certainly aside from the Terry Francona news, which came out last week and he's being announced today, our reason for being excited about this franchise is not very high. So I kind of want to go through some of you guys and talk with you about why you became Reds fans.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me, Seth. I'm excited to be over here. You're on my show, so
That's right. That's right. And I love to accept the invitation when it's offered. Thanks so much for having me when you do. Listen, we go from different reasons, like as far as where you grew up, certainly, but also who you came from, I guess is the way I would put it. And for me, it's my grandfather who made me a Reds fan. And that gets very sentimental, I know. And I know hearing your story before that it is for you as well. But can you take me through the first memories of being a Reds fan and how it happened?
yeah, absolutely. So, lived in Northern Kentucky my whole life. Most of my childhood was in Bellevue, Kentucky, which is a hop and a skip away from downtown Cincinnati. So, my dad grew up in my dad lived in Bellevue his whole life, his whole childhood, and majority of his adulthood. So, walking to Riverfront Stadium was part of just growing up for him. He talked about all the time walking out on his yard, if I could talk, and hearing in September 11th, 1985, and hearing the crowd reaction of peace.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's a cool thing. So my dad obviously is a child of the machine, and so when I grew up, I would always go to games with him. We'd walk over all the time. I always say that. So they bought me a Barry Larkin T-shirt. My mom and dad did one of those old, like when he had the 30-30
Hmm.
season. What is? Do you remember those shirts where it was like
Yeah, Jersey almost. Yeah.
not necessarily a jersey,
No.
but where there was like a kind of an illustration, and they had really
Oh
big
yeah,
heads.
caricature shirt. Yeah.
Yeah, a caricature shirt of Barry Larkin from his 30
Uh-huh.
30 season. And then took me to my first game, I want to say 95.
Okay.
So went a lot. And then 97, I was, 7, 8 years old. So I was a huge fan of Deion Sanders just because I thought he was
Yeah.
really cool. And of course, he played for the Reds in 97. And so I think that was the year that I got super hooked.
Well, and so here at the Riverfront, we range in age. We'll talk to Bill Lack here in a few minutes, and you can make fun of Bill saying he's the podfather, he's the older guy of the group, and all that. But at the same time, he got to live through the machine, and the rest of us hosts we didn't. And so you're the younger of the guys that I'll talk to for this effort, and I guess you don't remember 1990. Do you barely remember 95?
A little bit. I remember the Dodgers series not enough to where I could
Yeah.
have a conversation about it. And I remember bits and pieces of the LCS. So of course, like everyone talks about, I remember
Mhm.
Reggie Sanders really struggling. But I couldn't tell you the box scores of the games by any means. I only remember it really well because speaking of my dad played high school basketball against David Justice, who was part of that Braves team.
Okay.
Because he went to Covington Latin High School in Northern Kentucky, and so I grew up hearing about David Justice quite a bit. So
I was scribbling in high school on paper in an English class, creating what looked like an outfield, like a baseball field, and I had Justice and Griffey, and somebody else in the outfield, Reggie Sanders or somebody, thinking, "Oh, this would be the dream outfield, especially given two of those guys are from here." Yeah, David Justice. We all knew where he was from. Even I'm from Southeast Ohio, and it's like, oh yeah, he's a Cincinnati type guy.
yep.
Um, so that idea though that it's ingrained in us. Like I have the 1990 season I can fall back on. Right, it's getting further in the rear view now. My oldest son is now 2 years older than I was that year, so it's kind of
Sure.
it's kind of tougher to fall back on it. Much like a lot of people fall back on the Big Red Machine. Certainly, what do you kind of fall back on? Is it just the fact that where you're from and who gave it to you and things like that?
Yeah, that plays a part. 99, obviously. I
Sure.
mean,
Yeah.
being able to have your show on our network now where I can hear about from all those guys on that team and just kind of going to the ballpark a lot. So personally, my parents had just gotten divorced the year before.
Uh-huh.
I did see my dad every day. So when we did hang out, he took me to the ballpark. And so what a team to go see 2-3 times a week.
Mm-hmm.
Tickets were super affordable, and that team was just awesome, and you never felt like they were out of it. So when you have the Eddie Taubensees and the Scott Williamsons on your show, and I get to hear those interviews, it just takes me back to that year and what it meant to me, and obviously what it leads to in February of 2000.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact my idol, my hero, comes to the team because of with the success in 1999, that wouldn't be possible. We all know how that turned out, obviously, the next 8-9 years, unfortunately. But 99 team is definitely my fallback team. That's my, this is why I truly, truly love the franchise. And 2012, obviously, too. That was, there was nothing like that 2012 team to me.
Well, and we've talked about before, but the 99 team, I was a student at Ohio State, and I happened to have a roommate whose family's business had tickets. And I mean, I don't even know how many games we went to, and we blazed that path down to Riverfront from Columbus, and I remember the discussion was, are we going to eat after the game, and we go over to across the river to that TGI Fridays on the riverbank, I think it was,
it's not there anymore.
No, that's not the moorings are still there. It's kind of
that Hooters has lasted lifetimes.
Yeah, that's up the river a little more, but yeah. But we do that, or we would hit maybe exit 45 up the road, up 71 or whatever, and go to Max and Irma's or whatever it happened to be. But I remember some really late nights getting home, even during school. You got at 8:30 the next morning. Who cares, man? We're going to the Reds game.
Yeah, for sure. That team was the team to do that. I mean, like I said, probably not to question my father's parenthood by any means, probably wasn't ideal at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night having a 10-year-old kid walking a bridge.
That's
true. I didn't care. I mean, it was just being around my dad and watching that team and playing with them in MLB 2000, because that was when the games were a year ahead of the actual season, and just hitting homers with Greg Vaughn all the time and watching Greg Vaughn hit homers in person. That was the one thing that broke my heart about the Griffey trade, was they couldn't hold on to Greg Vaughn.
Sure.
And that was
yeah, we kind of convinced ourselves the consolation prize of Griffey plus Bichette would be okay, but and Griffey had a good year in 2000, not quite what everybody thought he would be, thought he'd be superhuman, but Cameron and Vaughn probably greater than Griffey Bichette, certainly that year.
Especially look at Mike Cameron's Seattle career.
Yeah. Was it 2001? He hit 4 home runs in a game. I mean, he just had a great run. He was a great player. He played well for the Mets when he played there. He's down the list because we certainly talk of Vaughn and Chu as 1 year Reds that always remember. But Cameron's, you look at his numbers, Cameron's up there. Ron Gann as well when you were a little younger.
Oh, I was a big Ron Gann fan for sure.
Yeah. His arm, his biceps just so big, and it was always fun to we got him because he had that ATV or motorcycle dirt bike accident, and we paid him for a year just to wait to get him, and then he hits 29 bombs and had a great year or whatever. But
it's kind of like I know it was a little longer, but I always put Kevin Mitchell in that group too.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah, I know Kevin Mitchell was there for longer than a year, but
my joke with Kevin Mitchell was there was a year where he had like a 17-game hit streak. And yet it was a course of like 34 Reds games. He was never really hurt. He just probably a little overweight, I guess, but he missed time. And it took him 30 plus games to play 17, but he got a hit in all of them.
That's true.
So yeah, that's what's amazing too, because you living there, and we'll have Joe Farfsing on later. He was from Cincinnati as well. And the idea that your idea of being around the team was earlier, because where I grew up, we didn't have cable. Mm-hmm. The games weren't really on TV that often. And it was just kind of a glimmer to me. Like Pete's hit, I don't remember. And I would have been 5 years old. My first real memory is Eric Davis in 87, really, really trying to follow that. And then I got to go to my first game in 88. So it is a little different when you live right there, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is, man. I mean, my funny stories, like you tell these like monumental stories of your first games, and mine are really funny. I mean, I remember going to a game against the Phillies in 97 when Terry Francona was the Phillies manager.
Mm-hmm.
Kurt Schilling pitched and Ruben Sierra hit 2 home runs for the Reds that day.
Okay.
Ruben Sierra played like 50 games for the Reds. It wasn't
Yes. It wasn't much.
I was at the game against the Cubs that same summer in '97 where Dion was trying to field a ball in left field and bounced off his head in the
Yeah.
foul territory. Willie Green hit a grand slam that game. I remember that really well.
Uh-huh.
Just yeah, those are kind of the things when you live here that you remember the sillier things about the
Yeah.
games you've gone to. Not necessarily the bigger names. Don't get me wrong, plenty of great Joey Votto, Ken Griffey Jr.
Sure.
memories, but I remember those things more than I remember some of this other stuff.
I was at a game in '97 when Scott Rowland was still early in his rookie year, and we got pretty good seats down in the blues off the third base side, and he just looked so big. First of all, he's a big guy, and guys around me, I have this sad ability, but sometimes good ability to hear what's going on around me. I can't tune things out all that well.
I'm with
And I
you.
remember these probably 20-something businessmen type guys talking about Scott Rowland and how good he was going to be. And I didn't know that much about him except for he's from not far from there. And certainly he turned out to be really good as a rookie of the year and then had a great career. And I remember hearing people talk about when Eduardo Perez played on that team and
Yeah.
talking about comparing him to his dad. Boy, it looks like his dad in the box. And I think he looks a lot bigger than his dad was, but okay. But no, stuff like that. My first game was the 1988. It was on my grandmother's birthday, so June 18th. I remember that. And Chris Sabo was the rookie, and it's June, so we know who he is by then. But he hit a home run, and then talking about Kevin Mitchell, he hit a triple, and he slid into Kevin Mitchell so hard the ball got away. Kevin Mitchell was playing third base at that point, and then he scampered home, and of course I've told that story on Redleg Roundtable. To me, that meant he had 2 home runs because
Sure.
I'm in Little League. So, those memories are great. You always kind of remember the firsts or the handful of firsts. All right, before I have to let you go, I know you're pressed for time. We have to kind of try to explain why we're Reds fans. Why do we care so much? If I asked you in a broad kind of way, what would your answer be?
That's a pretty lengthy answer off the top of my head. But I think it's, even though I didn't grow up with the Machine, obviously, it's hearing the stories of them like they were Paul Bunyan. It's going to Cooperstown with my dad in 2000 when Tony, Sparky, and Marty are inducted. And he's telling me this story about how Vida Blue was traded to the Reds and then the Major League shut it down. It's just kind of seeing these guys as larger than life people when you're a kid and just falling in love with that atmosphere of being at the ballpark on a nightly basis. And for me, it was just always spending time with my family and watching the team. And, I didn't really look at the good and bad of ownership until I was in my late 20s.
Sure.
I didn't think anything of it. I just thought, they're rebuilding. They'll figure it out eventually. You would think, especially as someone who grew up a Chicago Bulls fan, I would probably understand ownership is a really important factor. But I just think for me, what made me care so much about them was that it's ingrained in me because it's who I am.
Mm-hmm.
It's what I love. It's the only thing I know. I can't go to a major league game that the Reds aren't playing in. I'm not interested. I don't care.
Right.
A couple years ago, I went to a Guardians Royals game and had no interest. So,
sure.
When you don't have something emotionally attached to it now, I just can't do it. So I just think it's all I know, Seth. It's the only thing like I've ever known to love. I don't play video games with the, Miami Marlins. I don't play with the Detroit Tigers. I play with the Cincinnati Reds because I don't know anything else. And so for me, maybe that's not the best answer, but I just don't know how to not love the Reds because it's all I've ever known.
Yeah, it was easier in the 90s. I remember when the Bengals were so bad. I wasn't a Cowboys fan, but they were so good. The Cowboys were, and it was I watched them when they were 1-15, so I was like, I didn't know America's team. So like for me, I watched that first year Troy Aikman, and then I watched them do well, and they were on every week here, even in Ohio.
Yeah.
So when the Bengals were out of it, it was like, okay, I'm going to watch the Cowboys because I have interest in seeing them play. I can't really pick another baseball team to say, well, the Reds are out of it. Let me root for this team. I appreciate how exciting it is in San Diego right now. I appreciate Shohei Ohtani, certainly.
Sure.
But I can't get myself to really, really care. I mean, Paul O'Neill with the Yankees was the closest, and people hate me for that because who roots for the Yankees. But when Paul O'Neill went to the Yankees, I could kind of get there, right? And say, well, my rooting interest is in Paul O'Neill doing well, and I would watch them and root for them because of that. But I can't do it otherwise.
Funny Paul O'Neill story. You know how I discovered Paul O'Neill?
How's that?
Seinfeld.
Yes.
Yeah. So I watched the episode of Seinfeld with my dad, and he was like, "Oh yeah, Paul O'Neill played for the Reds."
Uh-huh.
And I was a kid, and I was like, "What? Really?" And so then, of course, he showed me a box of baseball cards. He told me about when he kicked the ball into the infield.
Yep.
And
Kicks left.
Yeah.
Yeah, my mom was, I probably told you that before. My mom was actually at his 3 home run game for the Yankees, which made that episode even funnier because he said, "Oh, nobody could promise 3 home runs or nobody could, whatever." But awesome. Well, Tim, thanks so much for being here with me. And we're trying to get at why we're all Reds fans, and I think we've hit it pretty well with your story. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Seth. I appreciate it.
Pleased to be joined by the Podfather, Bill Lack. Bill, thanks so much for taking some time with me.
Appreciate you having me on. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, I just thought, not every team out there, except for maybe the Yankees or whomever, has a sob story. And living here in Ohio, especially in Columbus, I get the Cleveland fans laments and all that. But us as Reds fans, we certainly can sit around and say, "Oh, we've got it so bad," at this point. But I guess what I wanted to do is go through and reveal to the folks listening or watching, what made us all Reds fans. And I'm sure many of them have some of the same stories. So you're, to be fair, a little older than some of us at the Riverfront. So I count that as a blessing for you, though, because you got to see the Big Red Machine. Tell me a little bit about, you grew up in Cincinnati, I believe. Tell me a little bit about where it all started. What's your first memory as being a Reds fan?
My memories, and I've told some of these stories before, but my memories of my early time being a Reds fan are all attached to my grandfather on my dad's side. My parents divorced in 1965, I think. I was like 7 years old, and my dad was working 2 jobs. I still saw my dad and everything like that, but he was very busy and had kind of a different life. And my mom was working her ass off just to keep a roof over our heads. And my grandfather kind of introduced me to baseball. He and my grandmother. My grandfather was a city bus driver for the Met. Well, it wasn't the Metro at the time. It was like, I think, Cincinnati Transit or something. But they also managed an apartment complex over on the west side of town. And I grew up on the west side of town my whole life until I went in the Navy. And at the time, Cincinnati was still per se segregated. And so a lot of the white Reds lived in their apartment complex over on Harrison Avenue. It was called Hilltop Gardens. It was near the corner of McHenry and Harrison Avenue. Pete Rose lived there. Jim Maloney lived there. Darren Johnson lived there. Art Shamsky lived there. Darren Johnson lived there. I remember meeting all of those guys when I was young. And my grandfather and Pete were pretty good friends. I told this story on the Pete Rose interview the other day. And my grandparents and Jim Maloney were very good friends. And that's how I did an interview with Jim for the podcast a few years ago that went on and on and on. And my way to get in the door with Jim was that he knew my grandfather, and they were very good friends. But my grandpa was in my baseball lineage. My grandmother, my grandmother on my father's side, her brother was a scout. He had been a Major League Baseball player he played 1 season in the big leagues, catcher for the Cardinals in '55. In fact, I've got his baseball card right here.
Oh, wow.
Nelson Burbrink is his name.
Okay.
And the family story is that he signed Tom Seaver to his first contract when he was head scout for the Mets. He was the head scout for the Miracle Mets in '69. Played 1 season in the bigs in '55. My grandfather kind of was the first person I remember taking me to baseball games. I can remember going to baseball games with my grandfather at Crosley, and because of my we called him my great uncle, because of his connections. My grandfather was what they called a bird dog scout in those days, and really what I think it was It gave you a card that you could show at any major league stadium, and you could get in for free. I'm not sure that my grandfather ever did any scouting. I just think it was a perk of having a brother-in-law that was a big wheel in baseball. But I can remember going to many games at Crosley Field with my grandfather. I've told the story, the Jim Maloney story. I don't know if you've ever heard me tell this story. We were sitting. They used to have a thing where the players would go up in the stands, and there would be a prize awarded or a prize assigned to every player that was going to go up in the stands. And they were shaking hands with the fans, and whatever this horn would sound, whoever they were shaking hands with won this prize that was assigned to them.
Wow.
Well, my grandfather had gotten tickets from Maloney that night. So Maloney knew exactly where my grandfather was sitting. And he comes up the aisle, and he's just staying real close to where my grandfather is sitting. And the minute that horn starts to sound, he rips his hand away from the guy he's taking it and turns around and grabs my grandfather's hand. And my grandfather won a television.
Awesome.
Which was a big deal in those days, This
Absolutely.
was like 65 or 66. I went back and looked on Baseball Reference to see when all of those guys that I had met were playing for the Reds at the same time. And it was 65 or 66. So the moral of that story was I ended up with that television years later. And my grandfather I can also remember going to a game with him at Crosley when they were playing the Mets. And at one time I had a baseball that Johnny Bench and Tom Seaver had both signed outside of Crosley Field.
Wow.
I probably played baseball in the yard with that baseball at some point, you're young and stupid. So that was my initial introduction to baseball. It was probably 69 when I really became a Reds fanatic. I can remember going to games in 69 with my grandfather at the new stadium that would have been 70, late in 70. But 69 was when the kind of the beginning feel of, Johnny Bench had come up. Pete was still there. It was the beginning of the big red machine. It was really but it was still under Dave Bristol, of course. 70, I can remember being so pissed at that play at home plate, the first game of the World Series, the Ken Burkhart play. 70, my next real memory, though, is 73. We just lost the World Series in 72 because Bobby Tolan misplayed 2 balls in center field in the 7th game. Not that I haven't gotten over that. 73, the Reds have a great season. They're playing them. They're getting ready to play the Mets, which is who my great uncle is still working for at the time, I believe. I sent in for tickets for a playoff game. I sent cash in the mail. That tells you how different the days were. And got my yellow, and I was sitting in the yellow seats.
Okay.
You remember the Riverfront?
Absolutely.
What was great about the yellow seats?
Padded.
They were padded.
Yep.
And I was sitting right down the left field line for game 1 of the 73 playoffs, which was a hell of a ball game, won on a home run by Pete Rose in the 9th inning off of Tom Seaver. And then by the summer of 74, when I started driving, I lived like my buddies and I, once we were driving, we could decide at 6:30 that we were going to go to the ballpark that night for by top 6, and we could be sitting in the ballpark at 7:30. That's how close we lived. And so I couldn't tell you how many games in 74, 75, and up in 76 up until I went in the service.
Well, take me back a little bit further backwards. Tell me what your perception, especially the first time, if you can remember it, of Crosley Field when you walked in.
I was very young, so this is kind of jaded. It's kind of how much of it is real memory and how much of it is what I want to remember. I can't really say, but it's like so many people talk about. You would walk out of the dark underneath the stadium and come up the aisle to the light.
Mm-hmm.
And the color of the grass. I can still remember the color of the grass and the size of the outfield wall. The center field clock and the scoreboard and everything was just humongous. and the terrace in the outfield. You know, the way that the outfield sloped up to the wall, kind of like Houston, but not as dramatically as it is at Houston ballpark now. And Pete Rose won a Gold Glove playing in that outfield on that terrace. I remember. This would have been when I was in 5th or 6th grade. Going down, you know, did they have the school safety patrol where you were? Where the kids?
Not where I grew up, Bill. I was so rural. We took the Monday after Thanksgiving off school because we might have got shot on the playground if because of deer season.
Oh, okay,
but no, my kids have safety patrol. Yeah.
Okay. I was in that one in 5th and 6th grade in elementary school. I can remember going to Crosley Field and sitting in the only time I remember sitting in the right field bleachers on safety patrol guard day and sitting out there. And that was a day game. I don't remember going to many night games at Crosley.
Okay.
But I remember the big things that stick with me was I can still remember the smell. Yeah. It was just smelled a lot of stale beer smell. For many, many years of, you know, and the green of the grass and the outfield scoreboard and how and it didn't seem small at the time, but once they moved to Riverfront, it made you think how big Riverfront was. Right. Well, what about, so it is interesting, not a lot of people talk about this, that they played basically half a season in 1970 in Crosley, and then they played the All-Star game at Riverfront, and then they played the rest of the year there. And certainly we look back as, I guess the phrase used a lot is, well, it might have been a dump, but it was our dump, you know, about Riverfront. Because you mentioned smells. If you got to go down into the bowels of the Riverfront to go to the blue seats, all I remember is that smell of wet concrete, you know, the kind of dank smell. But what about you at the time? What did you think of Riverfront? And it certainly was the wave of the future, was this AstroTurf and the, you know, cutout carpet and things like that. What were your thoughts as a young man a kid going to Riverfront, having gone to Crosley? And I was going to Bengal games kind of at the same time, so you know you'd see the switch over between, and so that was kind of cool. You know, you could play both of them at the same time. The other thing that they always, and this bothered me till the day they tore the place down, was that they never finished that stadium club that was supposed to be in center field. Yeah. Because the Bengals and the Reds could never agree on it. Sure. I was vastly impressed with, and I never thought Riverfront was a dump. I thought it was multi-purpose. It was what it was supposed to be. It didn't have any character. Right. None of those kinds of stadiums did. Three Rivers, Veterans, the one in Atlanta, they were all the same stadium. It's funny, though, because the move from Crosley to Riverfront with the bigger ballpark and the AstroTurf is what necessitated Howsam to make the change in the way the Big Red Machine was made up. Right. You know, they had to go faster. They had to go better defense. They had to get more speed. And that precipitated Joe Morgan and Cesar Geronimo becoming stars. Well, and certainly, yeah, you build it to the style. I mean, I think of the more recent example of that is like the 2005 White Sox. Remember when they traded Carlos Lee and they got Podsednik and they started on purpose playing small ball, and it fit what they could do, and they won the World Series. Now it's kind of a one-off, but yeah, it was a genius move to go get Joe Morgan, who I heard a story the other day about. Sparky obviously put him next to Pete in the clubhouse, and certainly he became just such a stalwart, and as you've said many times, the best ball player you've probably ever seen. Yeah, as a Red, especially. Yeah, and Morgan was a good player in Houston. Yeah, but I don't know if he would have ever been a great player unless he had come to the Reds. That may be selling Joe Morgan short. Who knows? It's one of those what if stories. Who the hell would ever know? But you know, and you heard even Johnny. A lot of people have said this over the years, but even Bench said it last week. Being around Pete Rose made every player better. Sure. So okay. Before I let you go here, we're going to do a couple of these segments in this episode.
who was your first favorite player? Do you recall that?
Pete.
Pete?
Yeah, absolutely. And I went the same high school, grew up
Yeah.
in the same part of town. And I said this in the Pete Rose thing the other day for those that haven't seen it. Everybody that grew up like my age on the west side of Cincinnati has some connection to Pete Rose. I swear, everybody does. You may have met his wife. You may have met Carolyn somewhere at the Wagon Wheel, which was a bar down at Glenway and Race. You may have ran into Pete's kids somewhere. You may have run into Pete somewhere. I can remember my senior year of high school. They were dedicating the road next to our high school, calling it Pete Rose Drive, and he came up and he sat down. He came up for lunch. Sat in the cafeteria. I can remember being at the same table. I was not one of the people from the school paper that interviewed him, but I remember sitting at that table and he was cutting up and having a great time with with us. If you grew up on the west side of town, you were probably a Pete Rose guy.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, almost any part of town, really, but specifically, you're right, the west side. Yeah.
And it kind of evolved into a Pete and Johnny thing, and then I kind of became more of a Johnny guy just because he was younger and 68, 69 was when I really got into baseball, and Johnny was exploding. And then 70, he just exploded, and had such an amazing year, and the team exploded too. So
sure. Yeah, that was quite a time, obviously, to have both those guys. I guess last thing before I let you go, we obviously feel like we are long suffering at this point. What do you say when it's just, I guess I would say it's just part of who I am, right? So what would you say to that effect of being a Reds fan? It's just kind of who you are at this point, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, to quote an infamous quote, where are you going to go?
He was more right than we thought, right?
Yeah, sometimes things are true, even though you don't want to admit them. But
yeah,
and I know people that have. I don't know people that have necessarily given up on the Reds, gave up on baseball.
Yeah.
Especially after the strike and the canceling of the World Series and all that stuff. I know people that never came back, and people that have gotten jaded with the money and that kind of thing. But I don't know too many people that were Reds fans and changed their allegiance to someone else.
Right.
I've known that more with Bengal fans.
Sure.
When you were in the desert for 30 years or whatever it was. But I know very few people that grew up Reds fans that changed their allegiance to anybody else, and it's like part of your DNA.
It is. It certainly is. Well, Bill, thanks so much for sharing some of these memories with me, and just keep on going. Hopefully, with Terry Francona, we'll have something a little better to root for here in the near future.
From your mouth to God's ear.
All right. Pleased to be joined by a prominent voice of the Riverfront, Joe Farfsing. Joe, thanks for taking the time this morning.
Absolutely. Looking forward to doing this ever since you came up with this idea.
Yeah, so the idea is pretty simple. Aside from the fact that Terry Francona was hired this past week, us Reds fans haven't had a lot to be excited about. And so I kind of wanted to get to the heart of things with some of the hosts on the Riverfront and talk about why we're Reds fans. So, Joe, I just talked to Bill a little bit ago, and Bill certainly is a little older than us, so he got to see more of the good times. You can make fun of somebody for being old, but then at the same time, you envy them a little bit. What's your first Reds memory as a kid?
I'll be honest, it's just going to the games. My dad would take, and I have two older brothers, and we would just go to Reds games, go to Riverfront Stadium, sit probably in the green seats. Never had to sit in like the red, but we did get to sit in the green seats and just being there for the game, seeing the weird at the end of the games they'd have Marge Schott would have her sign off on the Jumbotron when they got the video board, and Shotzi would like growl or something like that, like kind of spoofing the MGM lion. So that's it, just being at games, listening to them on the radio, just consuming them.
And so you grew up there in Cincinnati, right? Or in the area there?
Born and raised, suburban, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so from my perspective, it was like a 3-hour drive where I grew up. So it did come naturally to me as well because of my grandfather. But at the same time, not the access that you had. I was probably 8 years old before I got to go to a game. So okay. 8 or 9. Tell me a little bit about who was your first favorite player? Who's your first favorite Reds player?
My era, I mean, because I'm about the same age as you, so I was born in '80. Even when Pete and Tony Perez came back, those guys were,
Yeah.
those guys were at the end of their career. They were, so washed up or whatever you want to call them, but those weren't my guys. They were old. My guys were Dave Parker and Eric Davis, and then shortly thereafter, Barry Larkin debuted in '86. So those guys, the core of the late '80s Reds that were always contending, never over the top.
So, younger people today, and certainly us, even in our mid 40s, we're excited about Ellie De La Cruz as we should be.
Yeah.
But Eric Davis was legitimately, I mean, because we got Parker had some good years here, but his stardom started as a Pirate. Sure. Eric was legitimately known around baseball for that 2-3 year period as being one of the best players. And it was kind of neat to kind of put your chest out a little bit and think, we've got this guy.
Yeah, when you watch This Week in Baseball, the opening montage with I can't remember what the song is. The intro music, the theme is legitimately one of the greatest. It's Gathering Crowds, I think, is what it's called.
Yeah.
Look it up, and it's one of the greatest pieces of instrument or of music ever composed. And there's always a Eric Davis highlight of him, either his swing where he held his hands so low before he unleashed a quick bat, or going up over the fence at Riverfront stealing a home run. So seeing that guy every single week when you're watching that, you're like, that's my guy. Like, this is my team. Like, hey, they're relevant.
I have a memory of being 8-9 years old, whatever it was, and being at a friend's house, and they had a little TV down in their basement where we played Nintendo, but you could also get, the games if they happened to be on. And we were watching the game, and I remember my friend's mom being there, and we're playing something, but then all of a sudden Eric Davis comes up, and it's like, boom, we got to pay attention. And I told his mom, I said, every time I say he's going to hit a home run, he hits a home run. And I was like convinced that's how it worked. And so I said something like that, and he got out, and I was like, oh, maybe not every time. but
the curse was broke, or the spell was broken because you brought it up. It was like the jinx. Well,
and it's, I guess as a younger kid, you don't always understand that these guys are so good, yet they're going to make outs, right? I mean, it's like, especially where I grew up, you didn't have TV every day. Well, they weren't on every day anyway back then.
No.
But we didn't have cable or anything like that. So it was like what it would be in Cincinnati would be Channel 5, I think. In Columbus was Channel 28, and we could pull that, even though I was an hour and a half from Columbus as well. I don't know how many games they were on, but it wasn't many.
Seemed like once a month. It might have been more than that, but it was not.
It evolved at times, but yeah, and they never liked to do home games too much because they were afraid it would impact the draw of the crowd. It's like, dude, I'm 3 hours away. We're not getting there after that gets off work. I'm sorry. But no, so we didn't get to see them every day. So the baseball cards and the sporting news and This Week in Baseball, those things kind of grew these guys to more mythical proportions, I think. And not that it's bad the way it is today. My kid can pick up his iPad every morning and watch the highlights. But I guess, what do you think about having grown up kind of in that last generation where it's kind of like that? I think it grew more in our minds maybe than even they were as players.
Yeah, for sure. And I, when I was probably 7, do you remember Baseball Digest?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I first thing ever to come in the mail that had my specific name on it.
That's good.
And so my parents got me a subscription, and they knew I was a baseball psychopath when I was really, really young.
Yeah.
And yeah, just being able to consume it that way. Sunday mornings in the paper, you'd have the full leaderboard of the batting leaders, and you'd have everybody qualified. So you'd have Tony Gwynn at the top of the list, and then some on the American League, you'd have like Rob Deere hitting 200 at the bottom of it. You can see every single qualified player. And just the way that we had to, I don't want to say it's neat. Obviously, it's nostalgia because that's what we had, just a handful of games on TV, unless you were a lucky Cubs, Mets, or Braves fan broadcast on a superstation. So that's what was cool. And a quick aside is, having cable, we had WWOR to watch the Mets. We had TBS to watch the Braves. If we wanted to watch terrible team, Braves were god awful back then.
Yes.
And then Cubs. So when the Reds were in Chicago, you could flip on and watch Cubs games as soon as we get home from school. So
I could get a station out of Huntington, West Virginia, where I grew up, and they would do Pirates games.
Okay.
So not every. It was a lot like the Reds deal, I'm sure. But sometimes, hey, the Pirates are playing the Reds. I can tune in, which is funny now because if you're in Columbus, you can't watch a Pirates game unless you have the sports pack and things like that. So it's like reversed. as a kid on a rabbit ear 13-inch TV, I could black and white. I could watch the Pirates, but I can't now. Not that I ever really want to, unless they're playing the Reds.
Paul
What about-
Skeens is still must see appointment viewing though.
Yeah. What about when you were a kid and living that close? Like, I guess describe to me a little bit about, especially maybe think about the 1990 World Series team. What was that like to be in the city as a 10-year-old then?
Well, so my brothers had a paper route. So we'd have paper and it was the afternoon route, which was really cool. So we'd get like the late scores and everything. So I'd be able to read that and have this immersed with it, just reading the newspaper every single day as a 9-10-year-old kid.
Yes.
I can't. It's hard to really compare it being at that age, and we were 25 minutes. Like we weren't close to downtown, but we still went to a few games. To be able to talk about how the atmosphere was, and if the city was buzzing or anything like that. But I mean, at school, that's all we talked about. I was in 5th grade, and my friend group, we were all a bunch of sports nuts, just like I was, and that was all that we were talking about. I mean, the Bengals were a good team that year, and nobody really cared, even though it was 2 years off of the Super Bowl appearance.
Yeah, the wave of the Reds, it was huge. I told a story where my grandparents took me out west, and the lead in the NL West went from 9 games to 3 in our 2 weeks out west, and we came back home, and I was like, oh my goodness, but even so, they didn't completely limp, but they kind of got into the playoffs there at the end, and certainly you had to win your division back then. But I think you're right. I think the wave of Reds excitement kind of really overshadowed the Bengals that year for sure. And then after October, we were able to let's watch the Bengals now. But what about baseball cards? Was baseball cards a huge part of your life growing up?
Absolutely. Started collecting them in '86. I think was the first year. My dad had a rule for the 3 of us. We were not allowed to trade because we'd all get together with neighbors and friends, bring your baseball cards. We were not allowed to trade any Reds. Didn't matter if we had 5 Dan Billardellos. We were not allowed to trade any of our Dan Billardellos for that rookie out of Pittsburgh, Barry Bonds, or anything.
No. Couldn't do that.
No.
So where I grew up, we had we basically collected our favorite players, right? You wanted to get some of other guys too, but you knew this guy's a Bo Jackson guy, this guy's a Jose Canseco guy. We had a Mark McGuire guy. Eventually, we had Ken Griffey Jr. that everybody wanted, right? But
yeah,
I remember trying to trade for Eric Davis's, and I would give up, a Bo Jackson for an Eric Davis, and so that was kind of the funny thing. And I remember in the World Series, because I think my friend was kind of caught in the middle because his mom was a Reds fan and his dad was an Indians fan. And I think he wanted to please both. So he ended up trying to please neither. But he fell in love with Mark McGuire his rookie year because he hit the 49 home runs. And he became a Mark McGuire fan to the extent that even though the Reds were in the World Series in '90, he was rooting for the A's. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, What are you doing, man? This is different. This is different than your favorite player, your favorite baseball cards. And when Eric Davis hit that home run in Game 1 off Dave Stewart, it was the first trash talking I did in my life. I picked up the phone, and I think his mom said, well, that's Seth, and he answered the phone, and I go, did you see that? Did you see it? And I try actually not to be much of a trash talker now because I just enjoy watching my teams play, and I don't need to downgrade or degrade anybody else's fanhood, but at the same time, that was huge for me, and that was part of growing up. That was, your buddies liked one team or one guy, and you liked another, and you hoped your guy was better, right?
That was in the A's were the one team, and this was before 1990. This was in the late 80s when Jose Canseco, McGuire, and Ricky Henderson, 88, 89. That was the one team that my brother and I, my one older brother, they were our non-Reds team that we still really, really liked and appreciated. We played baseball in the side yard. Exactly. We played baseball in the side yard, and it was always 2-on-2, and we'd do the Bash Brothers thing after, after every home run, or not that I was hitting home runs. I was always the little brother, but.
Well, that was also the mythical thing of it, right? The Bash Brothers, the A's, they're the big bad A's. They probably should have won in '88. The Tommy Lasorda, Kirk Gibson magic happened, and they lost that series. They They just took out the Giants, even though there was an earthquake involved in '89, and they were the best team everybody thought in baseball in '90. And that was part of it, Davis slays Goliath, and that kind of thing. And we were the little guy trying to swing up. And as a little brother, you kind of understood that, I bet.
Oh, absolutely. That was, I wish I knew. I wish my brothers like pulled for the A's over that just so I could kind of rub it in his face a little bit.
Well, two more things before I let you go. What about Riverfront Stadium? What are your feelings about that place? Because certainly I think it was in such disrepair that that's one reason why they needed to just move on, obviously. Yeah. But the place itself, because that's where we first went to games. What were your thoughts on the stadium?
It was so weird because it was just this perfect circle, and it didn't especially being younger. I mean, I guess I was in my 20s when they tore it down, but you walk in through the gate and then you walk through the concourse and you had no idea where you were. Like you didn't know if you were out in right field, left field, or anything until you actually walk out.
Sure.
You walk in on the green level and you walk out to the seats. You're like, oh, okay, we're on the third base side. We need to be over in the right field corner or whatever. But that was really just bizarre when especially when modern ballparks like. It's clear before you even get into the stadium where you are because the stadium they have actual neighborhoods and landmarks that to know where everything is. So that was the one thing, especially a little kid. You walk into that stadium, those stadiums were huge and imposing. Yes. I mean they were everything that they were so loud. The fireworks were terrible because they'd go off and you'd hear them the sound ricochet off of the seats in 5 different areas, especially when it was empty, when it was just the ricocheting off the metal. Sure. But so that was the first thing, is just how big it was and how you had no idea where you were. The other thing is, it was that field just looked terrible. At any time it rained, you just have these gross puddled dark spots.
Well, they would dump the tarp off in the outfield, and you could see the line of the tarp, and then it would be really, really dark green past it. Yep.
Yeah, I was not. I'm not a nostalgic guy. I appreciate my creature comforts. I appreciate things that are nice and new. So when they tore that, when they imploded that in December of 2002, I'm like, so long, old fella.
I was excited to get a real baseball ballpark because certainly that had become the trend. And the thing I'm thankful for, I was just talking the other day about Cleveland, the Jake Progressive Field, whatever it's called now. It's a baseball ballpark. It was one of the first 2 or 3 when they made that transition there in the early 90s. But it's still super steep if you're in the upper level. It's almost scary looking down like that. And that's how Riverfront kind of was too. But the idea is that, hey, the Reds stadium, when they finally got around to building it, there were some things that they kind of figured out by then. And I mean, even if you're up in the 500 level in Great American, you're not feeling like you could just topple off the whole thing and fall.
Yeah, it's obviously it gets progressively steeper, but it's not like. I've been to Progressive. I've never been to the top of the top, but I remember in high school getting top 6 seats at Riverfront. They were, I think, at that point $350,
sure,
or something like that. And not that we spent the entire game there, but just walking up to those seats, and it felt like you were trying to get to the summit of Everest. By the time you get up, you need a flag to plant, that you made it.
Well, last thing before I let you go, and I really appreciate your time. This idea, though, is that, hey, we just are Reds fans, right? It's just kind of part of who we are. Can you describe that a little bit if you had to explain it to maybe somebody from out of town or something like that?
And I can speak to it a little differently than you because I'm from here, and it's literally in our blood. Cincinnati's an incredibly provincial town. I mean, there's a reason that people make the joke that when people from Cincinnati ask what school they went to, they're not talking about UC, Ohio State, Xavier. They're asking what high school. They want to know what neighborhood, or if you're Catholic, what area of the city you went to. Growing up in the actual shadow of the Big Red Machine, I don't know if Reds fandom was ever as strong or as prevalent as the era that we grew up, because the players were still playing, for that matter. I mean, Pete and Tony retired in '86. I don't remember when Joe Morgan retired, but it was not long from there. George Foster was still playing until similar era. it's part of your identity at that point. I mean, Cincinnati is a smaller. I hate small market because that's just a terrible term.
Yeah.
But it's a smaller city, and your sports teams become your identity more than anything else. I mean, people from New York, yeah, you have Mets fans, you have Yankees fans, but that's not their identity. Whereas you go to somewhere like St. Louis, a little bit bigger than Cincinnati, but I mean, that's same thing. Like, that's their identity. That's who they are. So I think that more than anything else is just a way that, you know, as fans, it just kind of perpetuates stuff, goes through generational, because me being a Reds fan is part of who I am. So obviously my kids, or, you know, at least my son who likes baseball, he's a Reds fan because you're in Cincinnati. You're
Sure.
like, you have to be a Reds fan.
That's right. That's definitely right. Well, Joe, thanks so much for hanging out for a little bit and talking about, and again, like I was talking with Bill just before you, we certainly hope with the hiring of Terry Francona, things get better. But at the same time, we're going to love this team no matter what. That's kind of the way I felt with the Bengals losing to the Ravens. It just, you know, my son's going to go to school today. We live in the Columbus suburbs, and some random Chiefs fan somehow is going to make fun of him. And he's got a buddy that's a Bills fan because he's from up there. But, you know, it is what it is. We deal with it however we do. It's still my favorite team, and hopefully we can have better times to come. But thanks so much for stopping by.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Seth.
Thanks so much for tuning into this week's Redleg Roundtable. It's been a fun trip down memory lane with all of our contributors here at the Riverfront. We're going to do some more of those in the near future, and stay tuned for other great guests that we'll have coming up. On the Blue Wire Podcast Network, thanks for tuning in to Redleg Roundtable.